Hello, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Deb Cave. I am the MSN Program Coordinator, and today we have a special guest here with us, Dr. Cathy Robichaux. She is one of our adjunct faculty teaching in our graduate nursing program, and today she'll be talking about the literature review and synthesis. So welcome, Cathy.
Thank you. Thanks, Deb. Okay, so as Deb said, I'm Cathy Robichaux, adjunct faculty at the University of Mary. I'm going to talk about doing a literature review and synthesis, which is usually chapter 2 or 3 in academic work, including theses, dissertations, and DNP projects. A literature review is also part of most published articles and journals. And students often feel that the literature review and synthesis process is the most challenging section of the thesis or DNP project because of the vast amount of literature out there and other documents that are available and the time required to select them, critically analyze, synthesize, and write the information in a narrative format. So what is a literature review and synthesis, and why should I care? So of course, it's a necessary part of what's needed to graduate. And I've included some other definitions here, but perhaps the most important one is that it provides context for your work, or the so what part of support for the significance of your thesis or your DNP project. So in this presentation, I'm going to address the literature review first, and then the synthesis process. I'll be talking first about the initial review and then the final review. So these are some other objectives that an initial review can accomplish. It could be that your topic or question is really pretty broad and not doable in the amount of time that you have. So an initial review of the literature may help narrow down the topic or question and help you identify any gaps where your research or intervention could fit in. It can also help you in choosing a suitable design and or methods to collect data. For example, you may find that most of the literature on your topic has used quantitative measures, and there's a lack of qualitative findings. Finally, both the literature review and synthesis can assist with the interpretation of the results of your study or intervention by situating it within the broader context of the literature review. I'm going to go through each of these steps, although some may have been covered by the librarian, in which case repetition is good. Although the illustration depicts a linear process, it could be that you return to review more literature when you get to step 3. If, say, for example, you have one article that seems to be an outlier or doesn't fit in with the rest, and you want to find more supportive evidence or findings. I'll spend more time on the last step, write and synthesize, as that seems to be the most challenging for everyone, including myself. I'm also going to use some examples from 2 DNP projects and a thesis. While the overall structure of the review and synthesis is similar for both, the placement in the final document may differ, although it's usually chapter 2 or 3. There are also some pieces that may be included in the DNP document and not in the thesis, such as the literature matrix, which I'll talk about in a minute. So your first step is obviously identifying a topic. And this may take more time than you realize, and it should really try to be something that you or you and your team, in the case of the DNP project, are really interested in, because this is a lot of work that's very time consuming. I say that to students up front so that you can think about your time commitments in other areas of your life and how you're going to accomplish this endeavor. Once you identify a topic, which may initially be a broad one, a preliminary review or some background reading may help you and your team, if applicable, to identify relevant terminology and become more familiar with the research that's been done. Exploring review articles or secondary sources is another way to become familiar with what's out there. During this preliminary review, you can also note the authors of relevant articles, the journals in which they're published, and related terms. This initial or background reading may help you to refine your research question and purpose and identify keywords or terms to use in the broader literature search. And these are the examples I'm going to be using. One is a thesis on critical thinking, and then 2 DNP projects, one on advanced care planning and one on shared governance. So as I said, I'm using several examples. As I said, one a thesis on critical thinking, and others are DNP projects on advanced care planning and shared governance. And as you might imagine, there's extensive published literature on all of these topics. During the initial review, the thesis student identified that these key terms related to critical thinking, including the use of preceptors and transition to practice models, which helped to narrow down the research purpose in question. You'll also note that I've underlined in red those aspects of the process that should be documented and for your respective rubric be included in your final thesis or D&P project. And documenting your search terms and strategy should be clear enough so that anyone can repeat it. Here is also an example from a D&P project and the key terms identified for use in the broader literature search, including related terms such as billing and Medicare. As part of your search strategy, you want to identify which databases will be relevant. For example, for the D&P project on shared governance, the students searched the Business Source Premier database in addition to CINAHL and Medline. You may also have restrictions or limitations that should be identified before you begin searching, such as limits on publication dates. Some programs or chairs require that the articles included be no more than 5 or 10 years old. Additional limitations may include those related to geographic location. This could mean that you include only those studies or articles conducted and published in the United States. Primary sources are reports by the original researcher, while secondary sources are summaries by someone else. Unpublished sources such as key projects and dissertations. These are also helpful in identifying additional articles to read, especially if the thesis or project is fairly recent. Depending upon your topic and whether it's a thesis or a D&P project, you may also want to clarify whether the use of information from reliable websites, such as those of professional organizations, may be included. A comprehensive and accurate literature search is essential to obtaining valid information for your review and synthesis. The results of your search will directly inform your conclusions, interventions in the case of a project, and recommendations. Without a structured and comprehensive search, the results may be biased and not representative of the depth and breadth of the literature available. Being systematic and using a well-planned search strategy is really important. In step 2, you're going to run the research and then read and evaluate the results. Literature reviews can be organized sequentially or by topic, theme, method, results, or theory, or argument. For the thesis and D&P projects is generally by theme. It's important to develop themes that are meaningful and relevant to your research question and/or intervention. Take detailed notes on each article and use a consistent format for initially capturing all the information each one provides. These notes and an initial summary can be done manually using note cards. However, given the amount of information you'll be recording, an electronic file created in a Word document or Excel spreadsheet may be more manageable. Examples of fields in your initial notes may include the author, the title of the article, the journal, the year published, the purpose or objective, the design used, if it's a study, the sample, data collection measures, and the outcomes or conclusions. And I've included a generic summary table here. This is an example of several of the articles included in the thesis on new graduates' critical thinking. You can see that the one on the top left is a systematic review of critical thinking in nursing education. This can be considered a secondary source, but can also be used to assess the articles included in it for further reading. As I mentioned, with this initial read-through and with a more thorough review, you want to start thinking about grouping articles by relevant themes. So through the articles here are exploring interventions used to promote critical thinking. One addresses high fidelity simulation, and the other the use of concept mapping. The article on interventions used by preceptors addresses several different types of interventions. So interventions can be seen as a possible theme or subheading in the final lit review. The article on the lower right is exploring the evaluation of teaching effectiveness using the Lassiter clinical judgment tool. And this could be categorized under the theme of subheading or theme of evaluation, but it could also be identified as theoretical, since the Lassiter model was used as a theoretical framework for this thesis. One question that students ask, and one that I'm challenged by as well, is when to stop searching the literature. So there should come a time when you and your team, if relevant, feel comfortable that you've completed a thorough and extensive search. This isn't to say that you will not search again when you go through the final steps. Once you've executed your search strategy, you'll probably be left with an extensive list to review and determine eligibility for inclusion in the final review and synthesis. Depending upon whether you are completing a thesis or a D&P project, the use of one or more of these tools may be a requirement. There are a number of critical appraisal or quality assessment tools available, and you can also assess sources to determine their placement on the hierarchy of evidence, which is pictured here on the left, with meta-analyses and systematic reviews at the top and expert opinions near the bottom. One thing to consider in terms of the hierarchy is the pertinence and usefulness of subjective or qualitative information or research to your study or D&P project. And you can see the appraisal tool in the bottom right can be used for that assessment, while the one on the top can be used to assess quantitative research evidence. These tools are available as part of a larger research appraisal package available from the Johns Hopkins Center for Evidence-Based Practice. Once you have evaluated articles for inclusion in your final literature review and synthesis, you want to assemble the collected information in order to categorize it and arrange it for easier viewing. And this is an example of the literature matrix grid from the Advanced Care Planning D&P project. The headings at the top can vary depending upon what information is relevant, but with a group project, it's especially important to be consistent so that each member is extracting the data needed to complete the matrix table accurately. And an alternate way to organize your articles for review and synthesis is to create an annotated bibliography. This is similar to the matrix on the previous slide, but the information is presented in a narrative format. And this is from the thesis on critical thinking. In step 3, you've completed the review process and you're now ready to synthesize your results. Again, as I said, step 3 and really the writing of chapter 3 in general, it's often the most difficult part of the thesis or project for students. It requires enough time and persistence to complete successfully. I've included some definitions of what a synthesis is and what it's not. It is combining different things or parts to form a whole, or taking information from a variety of sources and forming new insights. It is not a summary or annotated bib, meaning that you can't just take what you have in those and insert them into the final review and synthesis. Your matrix or summary table or annotated bib can help guide the synthesis and writing process. Again, you're not just summarizing each article, but creating new information. To begin the synthesis process, you want to review and reflect on the findings across the studies included in your matrix, summary table, or annotated bib. And you need to take the time to review the findings in totality rather than as individual studies, and compare them for similarities and differences, patterns, and themes. For each of them identified, determine what those articles have in common and which ones in the group differ. If there are contradictory findings, you may be able to identify methodological or theoretical differences that could account for the contradictions. For example, differences in population demographics. Determine what general conclusions you can report about the topic or subtopic as the entire group of studies relate to it. For example, you may have several studies that agree on an outcome, such as collaborative relationships between nurse managers and staff nurses is essential to the success of shared governance. You and your team, if working on a D&P project, may find it useful to sketch out your initial thoughts in free-form writing and drawing, noting and depicting patterns and outliers across studies. Organizing ideas requires classifying them into categories, which can then be used in the writing process. Again, synthesizing is not the same as summarizing. This illustration depicts the difference. The 3 boxes at the top illustrate the approach that students sometimes use initially, basically a description and summary of each article without any connection or difference identified. The box at the bottom represents synthesis or comparison of the same 3 studies and presentation of new ideas or insights. I'm using a few examples here to show the difference between summarizing and synthesizing. The examples are abbreviated to fit on the slides, and each theme or subheading should be included more than just 2 studies. The first example is from the thesis on critical thinking. On the left, you can see that the 2 studies, one by Kim et al. And the other by Burbeck et al., are basically summarized with no similarities, differences, or themes identified. The study by Kim et al. Used critical reflection as an approach to develop critical thinking, while the one by Burbeck et al. Used the think aloud method during simulation scenarios. The synthesis of the same two studies are included on the right. The student has identified that these two studies are using active learning interventions, reflection, and the think aloud method, rather than lecture to promote new graduates' critical thinking. These two studies could then be included under the heading theme of interventions in Chapter 3 or 2. Another important thing to consider when synthesizing is the use of transition words that help the reader to understand the relationships or differences that you're trying to show among ideas or the connections between sentences, paragraphs, and sections of the lit review. For example, the use of the word similarly to indicate the similarities between these two studies. Here are some examples of other transition words that may be useful. So again, these help to avoid having your writing and connection of themes or ideas look choppy or disjointed, and assist the reader in understanding what you're trying to say. Of course, you can't force a connection or identify a contrast if it's not there, because the reader and your thesis chair will realize that. Here's another example from the D&P project on advanced care planning. On the left are two systematic reviews exploring barriers to the completion of advanced care planning that are essentially summarized, not synthesized. Each is addressed separately with no connection identified for the reader. On the right, you can see that the project team has reviewed what's included in the synthesis table in totality and identified that a common repetitive barrier to completion of advanced care planning noted in the articles was the issue of time. They also provided a contrast link or transition word, however, to indicate a difference between the two studies, as the Blackwood review is conducted in the UK, where advanced care planning is not yet billable. This is another example from a D&P project on shared governance. On the left, the two articles are summarized, again, not synthesized. The article by Dearman et al. Is described as a group process to develop the leadership skills of frontline nurses, while the OTT skill explored the shared governance experiences of nurse managers and staff nurses. Again, each is addressed separately with no connection or differences noted. On the right, the students have synthesized the two studies by identifying similarities, including the use of a qualitative design in both studies, and the importance of the relationship between informal nurse leaders and staff nurses in promoting shared governance. The use of the transition word, furthermore, provides additional support for the theme of collaboration. These studies, in addition to others, were included in the final document on shared governance under the heading of collaborative relationships. Although you may have addressed it somewhat in the body of the literature review and synthesis, the summary or conclusion section is where you describe how your proposed study or intervention is situated within the review and how it fills a gap or addresses a need. So you have already connected or synthesized the content of the articles reviewed, and the purpose now is to convey your own novel thoughts or ideas. In this summary of the critical thinking lit review, the student referred back to the major themes identified, including the use of assessment frameworks and intervention strategies. Then the student identified how her proposed study would address a gap in the literature by exploring nurse preceptive experiences promoting new graduates' critical thinking skills. In this summary of the literature and synthesis chapter in the D&P project on advanced care planning, the students again identified the major themes, including the barriers encountered and the need for better education for providers and patients. They then briefly describe how their proposed intervention would address a continued need for better strategies to improve advanced care planning completion rates. A few more additional ideas. I tell students that this is probably easier to write the introduction to the chapter after they have finished writing the main sections. The introduction to the chapter and the chapter summary are often quite similar, except that you're including how your research or project intervention fills the gap or addresses a need in the summary or conclusion section. It's also not unusual to decide to move pieces around or sections around entirely after you've read through the literature review and synthesis in order to create a more cohesive picture. There are a number of books, articles, and websites that provide guidance on writing the literature review and thesis. These are a few that I found to be quite helpful in laying out the steps. The first two are books. The one by Buckhouse and Dickens is fairly dense. It talks about literature review and synthesis kind of in the broader picture, not just in relation to a D&P project or a thesis or a dissertation, but it's really very well written, and that was published in 2022. The book by Roush is a step-by-step guide to writing a dissertation or scholarly project. It's probably a little more readable, less dense, and it is a step-by-step. It doesn't really delve too much into the synthesis process, whereas the Buckhouse and Dickens one really spends a lot of time talking about synthesis. And here are two articles that I found that may be useful. They should be available via your library. If they're not, you can contact me and I can send them. And just remember that this is a creative process. The whole literature review and synthesis is a creative process, and as such, it will take time and perseverance and persistence. So I wish you good luck, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.